Good morning, Junior 5. How are you today? Let's start with Unit 1. Unit 1 consists of two lessons. Lesson 1 called friction. Lesson 1 which is called friction. First of all, you have to know what does it mean by friction. Friction means the touch between two objects or any two surfaces. This touch called friction. Like when you slide down on a slide, there will be a touch or there will be a contact between your body and the slide. This touch called friction. And when the car moves on a road, there will be a touch between the car tires and the road. So this touch is called friction. And like when you rub your hands together, like this picture, so you feel warm. This touch between two objects or between two surfaces, it's a type of force. This type of force called friction force. This type of force called friction force. So, what is the definition of the friction force? This definition is very important. What does it mean by friction force? Friction force means it's the force between two surfaces. The force between two surfaces in contact. Acts in the direction opposite to the direction of motion, like this. When you put a cube or a book on your desk, okay, the touch between this book and the surface of the desk, this is a type of force. This touch is a type of force called friction force. And the direction of the friction force acts in the opposite direction of the motion. Acts in the direction opposite to the direction of motion. Like these pictures, you push the book or this cube in this direction, in the direction of motion, but the friction force in the opposite direction of motion. Acts in the opposite direction of motion. And this friction force causes the object to slow down. It causes the object to slow down till stop and stop. So the friction force, it's the force between two surfaces. It's the force between two surfaces in contact. Acts in the direction opposite to the direction of motion, like this. The direction of motion here, but the direction of friction force in the opposite direction. That causes the object to slow down and stop. Causes the object to slow down and stop. Now, we will talk about the types of friction. The types of friction. There are three types of friction force. There are three types of friction. Like, number one, friction between solid objects. When any two solid objects touch each other. So this is the friction between solid objects. Number two, friction between objects and air. Like when any object moves in the air. When you run in the air. This is the friction between objects and air. And number three, the friction between objects and water. Objects and water. Like when the fish swim in the water. So this is the type of friction between the objects and water. So there are three types. How many types of friction? There are three types. Friction between solid objects, friction between objects and air, and friction between objects and water. Let's start with number one, the friction between solid objects. The friction between solid objects, like any two solid objects touch each other. Okay? Like when you ride a bike and you push its pedal, okay? Then stop pedaling during the movement of the bike, okay? If you ride the bike and push its pedal, the bike continues moving in the same direction. But when you stop pedaling during the movement of the bike, the bike speed decreases gradually until it stops. Why? Because the friction arises between two surfaces when touch each other. Okay? When the bike tires touch the road, the friction force arises. When the bike tires touch the road, the friction force arises that act in the opposite direction of the movement. But when you stop pedaling during the movement of the bike, the friction force increases. So the bike slows down, its speed decreases until it stops. So the friction force, you have to know that the friction force arises between two surfaces when any two surfaces in contact or touch each other. So the friction force arises. And the direction, you have to know that the direction of the friction force acts in the opposite direction, is opposite to the direction of movement or the direction of motion. And the friction force is the reason for stopping the body during movement, because it causes the object to slow down its speed till or and stop. Okay? When the friction force is larger than the movement force, so the body doesn't move. And vice versa. Vice versa means when the movement force larger than the friction force, so this object move. Okay? So we have two forces. You have to know that you have two forces. Movement force that acts or move the object, and the friction force causes the object to slow down and stop. Okay? Now, the question now give reason. Slowing down or stopping the body during motion. Why you slow down or stopping the body during motion? Because the friction force between your shoes and the road that acts in the opposite direction of the movement. Okay? Now, the factors affecting the friction force. There are three factors affecting the friction force. Okay? Number one, the type of the surface material. Number two, the speed of the body. And number three, the surface area of the moving object. So we have three factors affecting the friction force. Type of surface material, if it's rough or smooth. Speed of the body, if it move in high speed or move in low speed. And the surface area of the moving body, if it's large or small. Okay? Let's start with factor number one that acts or that affects the friction force. The type of the surface material. The friction force depends on the type of surface material. Why? Because in the rough surface, the friction force increases. The friction force increases between the rough surface. But on the smooth surface, the friction force decreases. Okay? On the rough surface, if you push a pole on the cement or on the sand, so the friction force increases between the rough surface. But on the ceramic, the friction force, if you push or move the ball on the ceramic road, so the friction force decrease between the smooth surface. Okay, so the type of surface material affect the friction force between because on the rough surface the friction force increases, but on the smooth surface the friction force decreases. Number 2, the speed of the body. The speed of the body. There are direct relation between the speed of moving body and the friction force. There are a direct relation. What does it mean by direct relation? Means if you move any object in low speed, so the friction force decreases. So by decreasing the speed of an object, so the friction force decreases. Like these pictures, this boy moves in low speed. So the friction force between the tires and the road decreases because he moves this bike or this scooter in low speed. But in the fast speed or fast object, or in a high speed, like this car, by increasing the speed of the object, the friction force increases. If you move in a high speed, so the friction force between the tires of the car and the road increases. So in the slow object or low speed, by decreasing the speed, the friction force decreases. And by increasing the speed, the friction force increases. So this means a direct relation. By decrease, decrease. By increase, increase. This is called the direct relation. It's the meaning of direct relation. Type number 3, the surface area of the moving object. What does it mean by the surface area? Also, there are direct relation between the surface area of the moving objects and the friction force. Why? If you push this cube, this large surface area, large cube on the desk, by increasing the surface area, so the friction force increases because this is large area, unlike the small cube. If you move 2 cubes, large and small one, large one and small one, the large one, the large surface area, there is a friction force between the large surface area. Friction force increases by increasing the surface area. But on the small surface area, like this, by decreasing the surface area, the friction force decreases. So there is a direct relation between the surface area and the friction force. Okay, let's recap. So we have 3 factors affecting the friction force. You have to know that there are 3 factors affecting the friction force. Number 1, the type of surface material. Number 2, speed. Number 3, the surface area. Speed and surface area, there are direct relation between them and the friction force. Let's start with number 1, type of surface material. Between the rough surface, the friction force increases. Remember the sand, okay? The sand surface. And between the smooth surface, remember the silk or the ceramic surface, the friction force decreases. Okay? Number 2, the speed of the body. If you move in the low speed, so the friction force decrease. So by decreasing the speed, the friction force decrease. But if you move in a high speed, so by increasing the speed, the friction force increase. Number 3, the surface area of the moving object. Also, there are a direct relation between the surface area of the moving object and the friction force. By increase the surface area, by use a large surface area or by increasing the surface area, the friction force increases, but by decreasing the surface area, the friction force decreases. Okay? Now, give reason, there is a direct relation between the surface area, there is a direct relation between a surface area of the moving object and the friction force. Why? Because by increasing the surface area of the moving object, the friction force increases and vice versa. This is called the direct relation. Direct relation, junior 5, keep in your mind. What does it mean by direct relation? Means by increasing the surface area means increase the friction force. Or vice versa, and vice versa. By decreasing the surface area, the friction force decreases. So this is called the direct relation between them. Okay, thank you, junior 5. Goodbye.